It was a Sunday evening, October 30th, 1938. Across the United States, millions of families had already done what they always did at the end of a long weekend. They had gathered around the radio. The big wooden box in the living room, the warm amber glow of the dial, the crackle and hiss of a signal pulling itself across hundreds of miles of open air. For most Americans in 1938, the radio wasn't just entertainment, it was the world. It was the voice of presidents and prize fighters, of jazz orchestras and gospel choirs, of news announcers reading bulletins in those clipped, authoritative tones that made everything sound both important and somehow manageable. The radio told you what was happening. The radio told you the truth. And on this particular Sunday evening, in the last hours of October, the radio was about to tell America something that would change the way the world thought about media, about mass psychology, and about the terrifying, almost supernatural power of a voice speaking directly into your ear in the dark. What happened that night has been debated, analyzed, exaggerated, and mythologized for nearly 90 years. The basic facts are simple enough. A 23-year-old genius named Orson Welles sat down in front of a microphone at CBS Studio One in New York City and performed a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells's science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds. The broadcast was fictional. It said so at the beginning. It said so at the end. And yet, before the hour was over, phone lines across the country were jammed. People were fleeing their homes. Hospitals were treating patients for shock. Police stations were overwhelmed. Newspapers the next morning screamed about mass hysteria. And America woke up to a new and unsettling truth that the right voice in the right format at the right moment could make an entire nation believe the world was ending. To understand why it happened, you have to understand who Orson Welles was. In 1938, he was already being called a prodigy, a wunderkind, a theatrical force of nature who seemed to have arrived on the cultural stage fully formed, already extraordinary, already dangerous in the way that only genuinely talented people can be dangerous. He had directed Shakespeare on Broadway with all-black casts during the Federal Theater Project, staging a breathtaking Macbeth set in Haiti that critics called one of the most electric theatrical events of the decade. He had founded the Mercury Theater with his collaborator John Houseman, a company dedicated to bold, unconventional, slightly reckless interpretations of classic texts. He was not a man who did things quietly. He was not a man who did things safely. And when CBS gave the Mercury Theater its own weekly radio drama slot, Orson Welles treated the medium not as a platform for reading stories aloud, but as an instrument, something that could be played, manipulated, bent and stretched and struck with precisely calculated force to produce exactly the emotional response he wanted. The Mercury Theater on the air had been running for a few months by October 1938, and the ratings were modest. The show aired opposite Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy on NBC, and Bergen's ventriloquist act was pulling enormous numbers. Welles and Houseman were looking for something that would make people talk, something different, something bold. When a writer on the team suggested adapting H.G. Wells's 1898 novel about a Martian invasion of Earth, Welles was immediately interested, but he wanted to do something more than just dramatize the book. He wanted to make it feel real, not theatrical real, not radio drama real, actually genuinely, viscerally, terrifyingly real. And so he and his writer Howard Koch began to think very carefully about format, about structure, about how to disguise a science fiction story so thoroughly inside the conventions of live news broadcasting that a listener stumbling across it midway through would have no idea, not even a flicker of suspicion, that what they were hearing was fiction. The decision they made was this: they would begin the broadcast as an ordinary evening of music and weather and then interrupt it. They would break in with a news bulletin, just one at first, a small thing, an astronomer reporting some unusual activity on the surface of Mars, then back to the music. Then another bulletin, a little more urgent. Something had landed in New Jersey. Officials were investigating. And from there, with the relentless accumulating logic of a real breaking news event, they would build, interrupt by interrupt, bulletin by bulletin, eyewitness account by eyewitness account, field reporter by field reporter, until the fiction had acquired the full terrible momentum of fact. They would use every sonic convention of live radio news, the background noise of crowds, the slightly breathless delivery of reporters at the scene, the authoritative calm of studio anchors, the patchy audio quality of a remote connection, the static that cuts across a transmission at just the wrong moment, to make it feel not like a performance but like the real thing happening in real time. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and they knew it. Houseman later admitted that he and Wells had been aware with a certain uneasy excitement that they were doing something that might frighten people. The question they perhaps did not ask themselves carefully enough was how many people, and how badly, and what those frightened people might actually do. Broadcast began at 8 o'clock in the evening Eastern Time. The announcer, not Wells but a straight-voiced CBS man, introduced the Mercury Theater on the air and noted that tonight's drama was an adaptation of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. Then the music started. Ramon Raquello and his orchestra playing dance music from the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel in New York City. It was ordinary, it was pleasant, it was exactly what you expected from a Sunday evening. And then the first interruption came. Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. Voice was calm, the kind of calm that radio announcers cultivated deliberately, a voice trained to deliver catastrophe without panic, because the assumption was that if the voice panicked, the audience would panic, and if the audience panicked, civilization would wobble slightly on its axis. The bulletin reported that a professor at the Mount Jennings Observatory in Chicago had observed, over the past several hours, several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. It was unusual, it was perhaps worth monitoring. It was not, the voice implied, cause for alarm. Then it was back to the music. The interruptions grew more frequent, they grew more urgent. A meteorite enormous had apparently struck a farm near Grover's Mill, New Jersey, just outside Trenton. A reporter was on the scene. He described the crater. He described the crowd that had gathered. He described with the careful, slightly odd vocabulary of a man trying to be professional about something his professional vocabulary was not designed to handle: a cylinder. A large metallic cylinder, half buried in the earth, smoking. Humming with some kind of internal mechanism, and then the cylinder began to open. What came out of the cylinder was described in terms that were deliberately, carefully not quite adequate to the thing being described. A reporter groping for language, stumbling over his own words, falling back on comparisons that did not quite work. It was enormous, it had eyes, it had tentacles, it moved with a horrible mechanical fluidity. It was not anything that had a name in the English language. And then came the heat ray. A burst of intense heat that swept across the field in a fan of destruction. The screaming of the crowd, the static, silence, the reporter's voice gone, and then the studio anchor, slightly thrown, slightly rattled in a way that felt real, covering the dead air with updates, with bulletins, with the voices of officials who were trying to remain calm and were not quite succeeding. It escalated, the military was mobilized, troops moved toward Grover's Mill. There was a battle, the battle went badly. Martian machines, towering tripods moving with a terrible mechanical grace across the New Jersey countryside, proved invulnerable to artillery fire. Chemical weapons were deployed. The chemical weapons failed. Bridges were jammed with fleeing civilians. Newark, New Jersey was being evacuated. The governor of New Jersey declared a state of emergency. The Secretary of the Interior, played by an actor doing a fairly convincing impression of Franklin Roosevelt, addressed the nation with grave, measured words about the crisis. More cylinders were landing, not just in New Jersey, across the country, across the world. The thing that made it work, the thing that made it terrifying not just for listeners who stumbled into it mid-broadcast, but even for people who had heard the introduction, was the accumulation of detail. Real place names, real institutions, real official titles, and real governmental procedures invoked in the right order in the right language. Wells and Koch had done their research on how a real emergency broadcast would sound. They had thought about the exact texture of institutional panic, how a university spokesman would phrase things, how a military commander would phrase things, how a government spokesman trying not to cause a stampede would phrase things, and they had replicated that texture with uncanny precision. The fiction was dressed in the clothing of fact so convincingly that the seams were invisible. And across America, in living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms and bars, people were listening. Some of them had heard the introduction and knew it was a drama and were enjoying it as exactly that, a brilliantly constructed piece of radio theater. But others had not heard the introduction. They had been listening to Charlie Bergen on NBC and switched over during a commercial break, arriving in the middle of a breaking news report about a Martian invasion and finding nothing, no stylistic clue, no tonal marker, no production shortcut that would tell them this was not real, because Wells had made sure of it. He had anticipated the channel switcher, the late tuner-inner, and he had built his fiction airtight against exactly that person. The phone calls started within minutes, people calling newspapers, police stations, fire departments, radio stations, hospitals, asking what to do, asking where to go, asking if it was true, if the Martians were really coming, if they should leave their houses. The CBS switchboard was overwhelmed. The police department in Trenton, New Jersey, the city closest to the fictional Grover's Mill, received hundreds of calls. In Newark, according to contemporary reports, families packed their belongings and fled into the streets. In one New York City apartment building, residents reportedly dressed in wet cloths and handkerchiefs to protect themselves against the gas attacks. In Indianapolis, a woman reportedly ran into a church during evening services screaming that the world was ending, causing the congregation to panic and pour into the streets. The scope and severity of the panic has been contested by historians ever since, and we will get to that, because the mythology around this broadcast grew so quickly and so dramatically that untangling what actually happened from what people believed happened and what newspapers reported happened has occupied scholars for decades. But what is beyond dispute is that the panic was real for the people experiencing it. Whether it was 1,000 people or 100,000, the people who believed in those 40 minutes that an alien civilization was destroying New Jersey with heat rays and chemical weapons, those people were genuinely afraid. They were afraid in the way you are afraid when the world suddenly reveals itself to be a different and more dangerous place than you thought it was. And that fear, that specific quality of fear, is what makes the War of the Worlds broadcast one of the most important media events in human history. Welles himself had no idea what was happening outside the studio. He was performing. He was inside the fiction, inside the work, managing a company of actors and sound engineers and musicians with the total absorptive focus that performance requires. It was only when a CBS executive appeared in the studio with a face like a man who has seen the apocalypse, which was, given the phone calls piling up at the switchboard, arguably appropriate, that Welles understood something had gone wrong. Or right, depending on your perspective. He later claimed he had been aware the broadcast might disturb some people. What he had not anticipated, or perhaps what he had not allowed himself to fully anticipate, was the scale, the speed, the almost viral spread of fear through a population that had, without quite realizing it, been primed for exactly this. Because that is the other thing you have to understand about October 1938. The world in 1938 was terrifying in ways that were entirely real, that required no science fiction to dramatize. Hitler had just annexed Austria and the Sudetenland. Europe was staggering toward a war that everyone could see coming, but nobody seemed able to stop. Radio had been used in Germany and in Italy to broadcast the voices of fascist leaders to mass audiences with a directness and intimacy that traditional media could not match, and those broadcasts had produced in the populations who heard them responses that observers in other countries found deeply disturbing and deeply difficult to explain. The power of the voice, the power of the broadcast. The way a voice coming out of a wooden box in your living room could bypass your critical faculties and speak directly to something older and more primitive, something that knew about danger and crowds and the end of things. Americans in 1938 were already anxious. They had lived through 15 years of genuinely frightening economic catastrophe. They were watching Europe with the specific anxiety of people who know that the thing happening over there will eventually come over here. They had been told, by official voices over official airwaves, to be vigilant, to be alert, to be prepared. And when a voice came out of the radio and told them, in the exact tones, and with the exact procedural vocabulary of an official emergency broadcast, that something unprecedented and catastrophic was happening, some part of them was ready to believe it. Some part of them had been waiting for it. The Martians were, in a very real psychological sense, not entirely a surprise. They were just a new name for the catastrophe that already felt inevitable. When the broadcast ended and it became clear that it had been a drama, the reaction came in waves. Relief, embarrassment, anger, a great deal of anger. Newspapers across the country condemned the broadcast in the strongest terms. The New York Times ran a front-page story. The FCC launched an investigation. Senators made speeches about the irresponsibility of allowing this kind of thing on public airwaves. There were calls for regulation, for censorship, for Welles to be arrested, for CBS to lose its broadcasting license. The switchboard at CBS had been receiving outraged calls since before the broadcast was even over, and they continued for days. People who had been frightened were humiliated by their own fear, and humiliation, as any student of mass psychology will tell you, tends to express itself as rage directed outward rather than inward. Orson Welles appeared at a press conference the morning after the broadcast wearing an expression of carefully calibrated contrition. He said he was sorry. He said he had not intended to cause widespread alarm. He said he was shocked and dismayed by the public reaction. Whether any of this was entirely sincere is a matter of some debate. Welles was a great actor, and he was also a young man whose career had just gone from notable to stratospheric overnight. The War of the Worlds broadcast made Orson Welles famous in a way that nothing else could have. Within 2 years he was in Hollywood making Citizen Kane. The trajectory from the CBS studio on October 30, 1938 to the most celebrated debut film in cinema history runs in a remarkably straight line. And the fuel for that trajectory was the panic, the outrage, the front-page headlines, the congressional hearings, all of it. Welles understood something that the newspaper editors and the senators perhaps did not. that there is no such thing in the media world as bad publicity of sufficient magnitude. But let us step back from Orson Welles for a moment, because the story of the War of the Worlds broadcast is not really about him. He was the instrument. He was the craftsman who built the device. What the story is really about is the device itself and what the device revealed. The broadcast was, among other things, one of the first documented demonstrations of what we now call media manipulation, the systematic exploitation of a medium's formal conventions to produce a desired effect in an audience. Wells and Koch did not invent this. Propaganda had been doing it for centuries, but they did it with a precision and self-awareness that was new, and they did it in a new medium that had not yet developed the antibodies. Radio was young. The conventions of radio news were being established in real time, and audiences had not yet learned to be skeptical of them, had not yet developed the habits of critical listening that come with experience. They heard a news bulletin and they believed it was a news bulletin. Because that was what news bulletins sounded like, and nobody had yet shown them that the sound of a news bulletin could be faked. The study of what actually happened that night, as opposed to what was reported to have happened, has produced some surprising conclusions. The historian Jefferson Pooley and the media scholar Michael Sokolow published research in 2013 arguing that the Panic of October 30, 1938 was substantially a myth, created and amplified by newspapers for their own reasons. Their argument goes like this. The Mutual Broadcasting System had recently been granted a license to compete with CBS and NBC, which gave advertisers a new option and weakened the established network's grip on the market. More importantly, radio in general was beginning to compete seriously with newspapers for both advertising revenue and public trust. People were turning to the radio for news, and newspapers were losing readers and prestige. The War of the Worlds panic was, for newspapers, a gift. It allowed them to run enormous outraged front-page stories about the dangers of an unregulated medium, the irresponsibility of radio broadcasters, the naivete of radio listeners. It allowed them to position radio as a fundamentally untrustworthy medium, prone to deception and mass hysteria, compared to the stable, responsible, print-based journalism that newspapers exemplified. The exaggeration of the panic, and Pooley and Sokolow argue that it was substantially exaggerated, that the actual number of genuinely panicked people was far smaller than reported, served a very specific institutional interest. This is itself a fascinating lesson. The story of a media panic became a media panic in its own right. The newspapers, in their rush to condemn the irresponsibility of radio, produced their own version of sensationalism, their own manufactured crisis, their own exploitation of public anxiety for circulation purposes. The medium that was supposed to be the responsible one turned out to be playing exactly the same game, just with slightly different rules. And this meta-irony, the fact that the coverage of the War of the Worlds panic was itself a form of the thing it was criticizing, has made the event endlessly productive as a case study for media scholars, because it illustrates something fundamental about how media ecosystems work. Every medium, when it feels threatened, will use its tools to defend its position. And the tools of journalism, wielded in the service of institutional self-interest rather than truth, produce their own distortions, their own panics, their own versions of the fictional invasion. What can we say with confidence? We can say that some people were genuinely frightened. We can say that some people called police stations and hospitals. We can say that the CBS switchboard was overwhelmed. We can say that in certain communities, particularly those with existing anxieties, immigrant communities, communities in the shadow of genuine political uncertainty, the reaction was more intense than in others. We can say that Hadley Cantrell, a Princeton psychologist who conducted a rigorous study of the broadcast's effects in the months that followed, found that somewhere between 1 and 6 million people had heard the program, and that a significant minority, perhaps a quarter to a third, had believed at some point that it described a real event. Cantrell's study, published in 1940 as The Invasion from Mars, a study in the psychology of panic, is one of the founding texts of media psychology, and its conclusions are as relevant now as they were in 1940, perhaps more so. Cantrell was interested in why some people believed the broadcast and others did not. He found that the most significant factor was not intelligence or education level or even familiarity with radio. The most significant factor was critical thinking, the habit of checking a claim against other sources before accepting it as true. People who turned on other radio stations, when they heard the first bulletin, quickly discovered that no other station was covering the Martian invasion, which was a significant clue. People who looked out their windows and found the neighborhood quiet, who called a neighbor or consulted another source, quickly realized the broadcast was fiction. But people who did not do these things, who accepted the first source they encountered without checking it, could spiral into genuine panic surprisingly quickly. And Cantrell found that certain psychological conditions made this more likely: pre-existing anxiety, a tendency to trust authority, and what he called personal inadequacy, a sense that one lacked the resources, internal or external, to cope with a genuine crisis. These findings, that critical thinking is the primary defense against media manipulation, that anxiety and trust in authority make people more susceptible to false information, that the habit of checking multiple sources is the most reliable protection against panic, read today like a field guide to the information landscape of the 21st century, because we are all in our way, living in the world that Orson Welles inadvertently illuminated on that October evening in 1938. The specific technology has changed beyond recognition. The wooden radio box has been replaced by the smartphone. The CBS studio has been replaced by social media platforms with billions of users. The voice of the authoritative announcer has been replaced by the algorithmically curated feed that delivers information in formats specifically designed to feel urgent, credible, and emotionally compelling. The heat ray has been replaced by the viral tweet, the deepfake video, the coordinated inauthentic behavior campaign, the bot network seeding false stories across platforms faster than any fact-checker can respond. But the fundamental dynamic, the exploitation of a medium's formal conventions to produce panic, outrage, or belief in false information, is exactly the same. What Wells did with microphones and actors and a studio and a borrowed aesthetic of breaking news, a sophisticated disinformation campaign does today with servers and algorithms and a borrowed aesthetic of organic social media content. The target is the same: the human tendency to trust the format before questioning the content, to believe something because it arrives wrapped in the familiar clothing of truth. And the defense is the same: the habit of critical thinking, the reflex of checking sources, the hard-won skepticism about any single channel of information. There is something almost poignant about the War of the Worlds broadcast when you look at it from this distance. It was, in its way, an innocent thing, a piece of brilliant, irresponsible theater made by a young man who was more interested in the aesthetic possibilities of his medium than in the sociological consequences. Wells was not trying to destabilize democracy or manipulate an election or cause a war. He was trying to make great radio. He was trying to make something that would be remembered, that would demonstrate what the medium was capable of when handled by someone who understood it as art. The panic was a side effect of artistic ambition, not its goal. And the fact that the panic happened, the fact that the art was so convincing that it punctured reality, was proof, in a terrible and somewhat alarming way, that the ambition had succeeded. The FCC decided, after its investigation, not to impose major new regulations on radio broadcasting. They issued new guidelines suggesting that fictional broadcasts should not use the format of news bulletins in ways that could mislead audiences, but they stopped well short of the kind of censorship that many newspapers were calling for. Wells received a stern talking to and went back to making radio. He adapted Dracula and Treasure Island and the 39 Steps with the same technical sophistication and narrative daring that had produced the War of the Worlds, though never again with quite the same unintended consequence. 2 years later he was in Hollywood, and 2 years after that he had made Citizen Kane, which is about, among other things, the way that a powerful media figure can shape reality for millions of people, constructing a version of the world that serves his own interests and that people consume without questioning because it arrives in such a convincing package. It is perhaps not accidental that the man who accidentally demonstrated the power of media manipulation went on to make the greatest film ever made about media manipulation. Wells understood something in his bones about the relationship between form and belief, between the way a story is told and the reality it creates in the listener's mind. That understanding is the lasting gift, if gift is the right word, of October 30th, 1938. The night America panicked taught us something we needed to know. And something we keep needing to relearn. Media shapes reality, not by changing the facts necessarily, but by changing the frame around the facts, the tone in which they are delivered, the format that tells your brain whether to believe or doubt. A voice that sounds like authority becomes authority. A story told in the rhythms of news becomes news. A claim that arrives wrapped in the emotional textures of truth, urgency, specificity, official procedure, the breathless credibility of an eyewitness account, bypasses the part of your brain that evaluates evidence and speaks directly to the part that responds to threat. It doesn't matter in that moment whether it's true. What matters is whether it feels true. And in 1938 and in 1988 and in 2038, the most dangerous thing in the world is a lie that feels true. A lie told not with facts but with feelings, not with evidence but with format, not with content but with style. Orson Welles walked out of Studio One on the morning of October 31st, 1938, into a city that was still buzzing with what he had done. He was 23 years old. He had just accidentally conducted the greatest experiment in media psychology that the 20th century would produce. He had demonstrated, in a single hour of radio, what scholars and propagandists and media theorists had been arguing about for decades: that the medium is not a neutral carrier of information, that the way you say something changes what it means, that a technically sophisticated deployment of a medium's native conventions can make an audience believe almost anything. He had demonstrated this so effectively and so publicly and at such cost to public order that the demonstration itself became a permanent part of the cultural record, a reference point that everyone who thinks seriously about media must eventually grapple with. The invasion never came. The heat ray was sound effects. The Martians were actors. The Secretary of the Interior was a voice impression. Grover's Mill, New Jersey, the little town where, according to the broadcast, the cylinders first landed, actually exists, and if you drive through it today you will find a small plaque and a monument commemorating the night it was briefly the most famous piece of Earth on the planet. The town held a 50th anniversary celebration in 1988. Orson Welles did not attend. He had died 3 years earlier in 1985 in his Hollywood home, alone at a desk in the middle of writing something. He was 70 years old and he had never quite managed to repeat the specific alchemical success of his early work, though he had spent 4 decades brilliantly, prolifically, magnificently trying. But the broadcast lives on. It lives on in media studies classrooms and in history books and in every serious conversation about disinformation and propaganda and the vulnerability of democratic societies to large-scale psychological manipulation. It lives on because it is a perfect, contained, intensely dramatic illustration of something that we cannot afford to forget: that the most powerful weapon ever devised by human beings is not a gun or a bomb or a heat ray from the surface of Mars. It is a story. A story told in the right voice in the right format at the right moment to an audience that is afraid and trusting and not quite skeptical enough. A story like that can move armies, can topple governments, can send an entire nation running into the streets to escape an enemy that does not exist. And that is why, all these years later, we are still telling this one.